Are you not entertained? Hello everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Real History. I am your host, Jared Frederick, and tonight we have a real blockbuster lined up for you. That is Ridley Scott's 2000 epic entitled Gladiator. This is a movie that many of you have been asking for over the past year of our channel, and we are here to deliver. And my oh my, do we have some commentary lined up for you on this one. We should think of this movie not only as a historical interpretation of Rome at a given period of time, but we also need to think of this movie, as we do many historical films, as a cultural product of the era in which it was made. And at least some historians have drawn the conclusion that this film is kind of a mythical representation, perhaps of what Americans desired their own country to be to an extent in the late 1990s, when a presidential election was on the horizon, and Americans were looking for one of their own, forms of General Maximus, to take leadership of the country. More on that to come. Additionally, too, we should think of Rome as this kind of allegorical setting, I think in the same way that many American audiences look at the American West. We look for this archetypal sort of hero to be found in this sort of setting. And likewise, Rome is also a parable that many historians and even politicians use as a barometer to avoid the decline of the American empire, perhaps to say. And so there's all sorts of interesting parallels and cross connections and conversations to be had as one watches this film. And there are many interpretations that can be drawn that we will get into. And of course, as well, we'll be talking about the historical accuracies, or perhaps more so with this movie, inaccuracies that play throughout. So, this is a longer one. Let's go ahead and get started and take a look at Gladiator. Right at the outset, as we start off here, I think it's worth mentioning that the so-called sword and sandal epic that was very common in movie theaters in the 1950s and the 1960s, that had pretty much disappeared after the abysmal economic performance of 1964's Fall of the Roman Empire, directed by Anthony Mann. Up until this movie, there was no big Roman history movie with gladiators or anything like that. And I think one could argue that the economic success of this film gave a rebirth to the sort of old-style Hollywood epic that many of these directors grew up with in the post-World War II era. It's very interesting to point out that so many movies that are known for their very excessive violence start out in these very sort of placid settings. You think of Saving Private Ryan, which was released the year before this movie was shot. It starts this tranquil setting in a quiet cemetery. And here with Gladiator, we start out with a man running his hand through, these quiet shafts of wheat. It's just kind of interesting from an artistic standpoint. I think that's the only time Russell Crowe smiles in this whole movie, is when he has this brief flashback at the beginning of the film. Even though this is set in Germania, this was filmed in a large forested area in Surrey, in England. The local conservation entity was in the process of deforesting this place. So it worked quite well in that regard. And of course, they could get away with burning down entire forests and cutting them down as well, because the whole place was going to be deforested anyway.
How long has he been gone?
Nearly 2 hours. Will they fight, sir?
We shall know soon enough.
What we also see here is a far cry from a lot of earlier cinematic depictions of Roman history, where people are wearing very colorful, sometimes gaudy clothing. This is a very dark, Everything is very grimy. It sets the stage, and it certainly may be ahistorical in regard to the clothing. Certainly the uniforms and the wardrobe in this film look very rich, but they're sometimes centuries off the mark. Imagine an American cowboy in a movie, wearing like knee-high stockings and a tricorn hat. That's like essentially what you have here in a lot of this film.
People should know when they're conquered.
To paraphrase Buck Compton off of Band of Brothers, as Easy Company was sitting in the Ardennes. More formally, we have here a mixture of Germanic tribes, Samaritans, and Goths coming in to sweep the shit out of Rome.
Visigoths, Jesus Christ.
Would you, Quintus? Would I?
Right here from the outset, we see this warrior ethos here, just of these informal conversations that Maximus is having with Quintus. The ideas of honor. We see him rubbing his hands, kind of speculating, that if he's going to die, he's going to be returning to the earth, being buried in the earth. And that is also a bit of a prognostication of perhaps what awaits his character a little bit later on. So what we see here in these representations of battle, this was part of a years-long conflict known as the Macromanic Wars, which was fought in this Germanic region of the Roman Empire. It was fought around 166 AD up to 180 AD when this film takes place.
3 weeks from now, I will be harvesting my crops. Imagine where you will be, and it will be so.
And just for the record here, Maximus is an entirely fictional character. There's no such person as Maximus in real life, although he's probably an amalgamation of a number of different historical characters. One person that he is possibly based off of is Cincinnatus, this virtuous farmer who rises to the role of dictator. His country calls upon him. He's kind of this farmer. He does not aspire to any political ambitions. He serves out of a sense of duty. And the part here where Russell Crowe's character says that, he dreams of going back to his farm, it very much evokes that sort of temperament. And it's for this reason, when we think about American history, this is often why George Washington is referred to as the American Cincinnatus. Here was a guy who didn't really want to, be engaged in warfare on a constant basis, didn't necessarily want to be president, but the dictates of his society demanded so upon him. And so I think that's a very apt analogy, perhaps. And no. There were no catapults being used in this area for this campaign at this time. Catapults were not something that an army could easily lug around into the wilderness like this. Catapults were used for sieges, long-term warfare of entrenched fixed positions. And, this is the same sort of anachronisms that we see in the likes of the Patriot at the Battle of Cowpens, where you have British artillerists having these big siege guns, just because it looks more impressive on camera. And so there's all sorts of historical liberties taken here. And man, oh man, I don't know where they got the napalm either. And then there's the little things too. If you think about the equestrian skills of, Roman horsemen, they didn't have stirrups. That's not how they rode horses, but that was a precaution taken for the benefit of the extras and the safety on set. So we'll give them a pass on that one in the name of safety. We do, though, here get a good sense of kind of the tactical representation of how Roman legions might fight in close quarters combat too. So, once again, visualizations help, even if there are many things surrounding it that may be inaccurate. Here too, with these opening battle scenes, once again, you can get a sense of the artistic influence of a movie like Saving Private Ryan. You see the picture is desaturated, it's rather bluish, the scenes conveyed are incredibly violent, there is stop motion camera work, and so you very much get the sense that even though this is almost 2 centuries before the Normandy invasion of 1944, that they're trying to recreate that sort of cinematic grittiness that Steven Spielberg captured just about 2 years prior. You know, and the clothing of the Germanic tribes is just way off too. I mean, you know, it looks like they got their wardrobe out of the old Capital One commercials with the barbarians. It's just way off by a long stretch of time. And here we are introduced to Marcus Aurelius, who in reality was much younger than Richard Harris was, the actor who played him at this time. Marcus Aurelius was about 58 years of age, but he had long been fighting this campaign in the Germanic region. And during that time, he wrote his iconic Meditations, which was this reflection on his Stoic philosophy that was a foundation for his notion of role in Rome.
And the senators, you wouldn't have summoned them.
Peace, Commodus. 2 weeks on the road, your incessant scheming is hurting my head.
Chief amongst the principles preached by Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations were justice, truth, temperance, and courage. And kind of loosely speaking, these become the foundations for the storyline because it begs the audience, what makes a good leader? You know, what principles guide General Maximus in his various endeavors? And so, you know, these are sort of, you know, interesting philosophical questions to consider when you look at the real life Roman leaders who were running the show at this time.
You have proved your valor yet again, Maximus. Let us hope for the last time.
He is Professor Dumbledore after all, so there is a lot on his shoulders here.
You'll pour a honeyed potion in your ear and you'll wake up one day and all you'll say is, Republic, Republic, Republic.
Well, why not? Rome was founded as a republic.
Yes, and didn't...
No, that's not true. It eventually became a republic, but it was certainly not founded as a republic.
But these senators scheme and squabble and flatter and deceive. Maximus, we must save Rome from the politicians, my friend.
The idea of Commodus saying that, you know, he wants to save Rome from the politicians is also rather ahistorical because he was in essence kind of co-emperor at this time. He was of the political class. He was of the political leadership. And so there was no reason why he would want to undermine his own class because he was essentially already in charge and sharing power with his dad. You know, when you look at the clothing and the material culture, you know, once again, one can make the argument that the clothing worn during this era in Roman history was much brighter, it was much more vibrant. But undoubtedly, what Ridley Scott was trying to do was to pull away from a lot of the visual stereotypes of these sort of toga flicks of the 1950s and the 1960s. Like, he didn't want to have people, like, sitting in baths, you know, eating from, you know, grapevines and, you know, things like that. He wanted to show something that was grittier, something that was a little bit more visceral, and therefore the clothing is much darker than what it would have been in reality. And so from a cinematic standpoint, it's almost forgivable when you think about what he was trying to pull away from. But in turn, when you look at subsequent epics, whether it be during the Roman, set in the Roman era, the medieval era, Vikings, like, everyone's wearing this very dark, kind of ahistorical clothing. And a lot of that is an aesthetic legacy of this misleading wardrobe that we find in Gladiator.
I've seen much of the rest of the world. It is brutal and cruel and dark. Rome is the light.
The idea that Rome is the light, as Maximus says here, becomes a big theme of the movie. You know, what sort of future are you going to fight for? What sort of Rome are you going to fight for? You know, but in reality, one could make the argument that they're fighting for a Rome in this film that perhaps never existed in the first place. And we'll get into more of that later on.
Pink stones that warm in the sun. Kitchen garden that smells of herbs in the day. Jasmine in the evening.
From what I understand, there were some considerable gaps in the script as they were filming all of this, and it led to a lot of improvisation. And from what I understand, this description of Maximus's home is actually, you know, Russell Crowe is deriving this description from real life, his home back in Australia. And so there's these nice little human touches in the film after all.
I want you to become the protector of Rome after I die. I will empower you to one end alone, to give power back to the people of Rome and end the corruption that has crippled it.
This is perhaps the most important thematic scene in the movie. And historically speaking, this scene builds the movie on a house of sand. Because Marcus Aurelius, of course, he never offered this position of regent, essentially, to Maximus, because, first of all, Maximus never existed to begin with. And also, Marcus Aurelius also chose Commodus to be his successor, and he had chosen this to be several years prior to this, in fact. And so the notion of giving Rome back to the Romans, of, you know, removing all of the political corruption, it really doesn't hold up to the historical realities of the time, because the emperor, nor the Senate for that matter, really had any inclination to want to return Rome to the status of republic. And so this movie gets off to a very faulty start, historically speaking. But, you know, it turns it into kind of this mythic quest for a moral parable, and that's really what the rest of the movie plays out as.
Maximus, stop. Is it really so terrible seeing me again?
No.
Lucilla, the daughter of Marcus Aurelius and the sister of Commodus, is one of only 3 or 4 real people in this movie. And in the movie, she is portrayed as a widow who grows highly suspicious of her aspiring brother. In reality, though, her husband was still alive all this, and he too would get involved in a lot of this real-life intrigue as it plays out later on. But you know, her character was almost killed off by the screenwriters. Her character was to die later on in the movie, but they opted to keep her in because, after all, she was the only notable female character in the entire movie, and they wanted to make sure that there was a strong female lead that ran throughout the narrative as a result, because indeed women did and could play a very large role in these happenings of ancient Rome.
Are you ready to do your duty for Rome?
The symbolism of all these busts of previous emperors here, you know, hanging in the background, I can't imagine isn't symbolic in the eyes of director Ridley Scott. You know, it's like history is watching these people. You know, and from my understanding, Marcus Aurelius, when he was on campaign, sold off a lot of the artwork and the finer things that belonged to him as emperor, but he hung on to these busts, and they would essentially bedeck his roving headquarters tent as such. And so if that was certainly the case, then that was one aspect of the real history that this film got right.
Wisdom, justice, fortitude, and temperance.
These rhetorical debates over Republican virtue really fit within the moral narrative and arc of the characters within the film. And of course, Republican virtue, something that the founding fathers of the United States would later latch on to, was the idea that one had to put society above oneself. You had to think of the collective good. You had to think about what's not only good for me, but what's good for everybody. And these were core principles of the Roman Republic while they were still in existence. And of course, this is meant to be symbolic here amidst these, exaggerated conversations among the characters. And these sorts of dynamics that are at play in the dialogue, it's more of a reflection on 21st century audience sensibilities about, what do you think representative government or, ideas of democracy or republicanism are. And so even though they may be ahistorical here, all of this is meant to be kind of a moral compass for moviegoers so they can further distinguish who's on the right side and who's on the wrong side.
If you would only love me.
It's an incredibly well-acted scene. It's purportedly Joaquin Phoenix actually passed out after he pretended to kill Richard Harris. But, historically speaking, it did not happen. Commodus already had much of this power, and even though several of Marcus Aurelius's predecessors had chosen adoptive emperors, if you will. They had chosen people other than their sons to replace them. That was not the case with Marcus Aurelius. He chose Commodus explicitly to be his successor. And so in reality, there was no reason for Commodus to kill his dad because his dad had already appointed him with the power.
Hail Caesar.
Sadly enough, this was one of Richard Harris's last movies. So seeing him lying here on his deathbed is sadly prophetic in and of itself.
The Emperor has been slain.
The Emperor died of natural causes.
Why are you armed, Quintus?
Guards!
In actuality, it's believed that Marcus Aurelius probably succumbed during a smallpox plague. And so, yeah, far less traumatic death, perhaps, than what we see here.
Praetorian!
The members of the Praetorian Guard here are wearing a purple color, which is very ahistorical as well. But there's a lot of anachronisms to be found in this fight sequence, including throwing a sword as such, have it go through somebody's body while they're on horseback. That would have been exceedingly difficult to do. This whole sequence is just so absurd because, okay, so Russell Crowe's character is referred to as the Spaniard. Okay, so are we to understand that he was wounded while fighting in Germany and he rides the whole way from Germany to Spain while wounded to go rescue his family? Holy crap, that is a big plot gap when you think about it. And by the way, they wouldn't have called him a Spaniard either. Back then it was known as Hispania. And so the use of the phrase Spaniard is also a modern phrase that would have had no place or made any sense in the context of Roman history. This is where I think the film bears some thematic resemblance to the 1960s Stanley Kubrick film Spartacus. And in that film, you have essentially a slave uprising challenging Roman authority that is at least cinematically depicted as being predicated on the notion of vengeance. And of course, vengeance is a major theme of this film. Interestingly enough, Kirk Douglas, the actor who played Spartacus, saw this film, and he thought it was very good, but it didn't quite have the sort of noble, egalitarian standing that a movie like Spartacus did. So an interesting perspective there.
Don't die. They'll feed you to the lions. They're worth more than we are.
The idea of being thrown to the lions isn't entirely an alien concept, because during the reign of Commodus, it was said that the infirm, the disabled, political prisoners, war prisoners, would often become the sacrificial beings who would be, thrown to, these carnivorous beasts and the likes of the Colosseum. And so something like that is not too far off the mark, perhaps. What I do enjoy about these scenes and seeing the Zucabar province, which is in modern-day Algeria, is that it shows the wide geographic scope of the Roman Empire as we near, the 2nd century AD here. And, this was a thriving crossroads community. It had some 5,000 people living in it at the time, comprised of Roman Berbers. And it just goes to show kind of this, the fabric of the Roman Empire. It had many diverse, things interwoven into it here. And you get a really good sense of that in these scenes.
Good.
Red.
Red.
In these scenes, we're introduced to Jaimon Hunsu's character, and such a fantastic actor. And he was coming right out of his breakout role as Cinque in Steven Spielberg's Amistad, which came out in 1997, in which he also plays a slave. And interestingly enough, that movie and this movie had the same screenwriter as well. And so you can see kind of the cinematic threads here that led him from one film to another.
Well done, Inga, there.
The letters SPQR, which Maximus is carving off of his arm, when translated to English, stands for the Senate and People of Rome. And so he's essentially, flailing himself of this old identity, if you will, because he no longer considers Rome his. In reality, though, tattoos were not too common among Romans, from my understanding, that tattoos were usually designated to the lowlier sorts of society. People who were slaves, prisoners of war, criminals, people who were forced to fight in gladiatorial situations like this. And so the idea of perhaps a general having a tattoo as such, probably another inaccuracy. A lot of these characterizations of the gladiator fights in this film, whether big or small, I think more so come from 18th and 19th century popular representations and artistic interpretations of what later people thought gladiator fights may have looked like. I mean, if you look at some of the classical paintings of gladiator fights, you can very much get a sense that these visual representations played a major role in how Ridley Scott crafted scenes such as these. There's been debate among historians as to when gladiator fights grew in popularity, perhaps 200 to 300 to 400 years prior to the setting of this film. But evidence suggests that they started somewhat small on the fringes and then grew in popularity during the time of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus. And perhaps one primary reason why emperors facilitated their popularity is because it served as a healthy distraction for the people from the broader political problems and discourse of the era. And so, you could win not only by dividing and conquering, but also by distracting. And I think some of the emperors knew this all too well.
I think I understand my own people.
Then perhaps Caesar will be so good as to teach us out of his own extensive experience.
This scene in the Senate hints at a few truths, a few grains of reality. Senator Gracchus, he's this amalgamation of real-life people as well. In fact, there were the Gracchus twins who were very much involved in Roman politics during this era, who kind of boasted themselves as champions of the people and whatnot. And additionally, too, with Commodus, one thing thematically that the film gets right is, that the historical records suggest that he was consumed by these juvenile impulses. In fact, dare I say, the film may not go quite far enough in regard to his excesses and his bloodlust and his various other unhealthy pursuits, which we'll get into a little bit later on. I think one of the great historical merits of this film, and there aren't necessarily many of them, but just to see this living recreation as the Colosseum as it may have looked, you can't help but to be impressed with it. And this film, at the time that it was made, of course, was using cutting-edge CGI in order to recreate all of this. And in that regard, architecturally speaking, the filmmakers, I think, really did their homework, because it's not easy to recreate such an iconic place that is so large in its expanse easily. And so, the tip of the hat here for that purpose, if no other.
It's the sand of the Colosseum. He'll bring them death, and they will love him for it.
And I think this scene with Senator Gracchus talking about the spectacle of the Colosseum, it really gets to the heart of the movie, about people being swept up in the violence. And the violence allows people in power to perhaps get away with some of the unsavory political things that are going on in more subtle circles.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained?
And this iconic scene in which Maximus is asking the audience, why aren't you entertained? I think he's also speaking to us, the movie-going audience. And I'll speak anecdotally here. One of my colleagues who teaches Roman history and ancient history, students walk into the classroom with this expectation when they are learning of ancient Rome, that all that they are going to learn about is of the Roman legion, these big, large battles, and also gladiator fights. And in the process, they don't get as excited about learning about all of the political drama, the intrigue, the ideals of the Roman Republic, or anything that followed, because they are so consumed by this mythological vision of the violence associated with the Roman Empire that it becomes easy to overlook a lot of the important political legacies associated with it. And so this scene in which Maximus asks, are you not entertained? It applies to us, the movie-going audience, as well, because not many people would probably go see a movie about a bunch of Romans who are debating political issues in the Forum. And so, ironically enough, whether or not Ridley Scott realized it, that quote can go both ways to the audience on screen and off screen. A comparable analogy for contemporary times is, why watch C-SPAN when you can watch MMA? All right, so that has taken us through part one of Gladiator, and due to the movie's rather lengthy duration, we've decided to break up this episode into two parts. So stay tuned for more commentary on Gladiator. We'll be right back on Real History.